Welcome to Moving Conversations, a podcast for movement professionals by movement professionals. If you coach, train, or teach movement, Pilates, or fitness, then this podcast is for you. With more than 60 years of experience in fitness and Pilates, your hosts, Brian Ritchie and Nora St. John, explore the science of human movement, diving deep into the facts, myths, and common misconceptions, hoping to spark thought and conversation about how we view fitness and movement. Now, let's jump into Moving Conversations. And welcome back to Moving Conversations. I'm Brian Ritchie, and joining me as always is Nora St. John. Good morning, Nora. How are you?
Quite well, Brian. How about yourself?
Doing good. Yeah, it's a good day here in DC. Rainy though, but doing all right. How about you?
I was just in the Colorado Rockies, and as you said, like, I'm not usually a cold girl, but it was beautiful. There was snow, it was gorgeous, and we had to drive down with a group of people from California on Sunday in the snow. So that was a little bit of a white knuckle moment. It all went fine, but none of us are that comfortable with the snow. So we're all like, okay, follow the car in front of you, stay on the tracks where there's no snow. But we all made it down safe and had a good time.
Oh, very good. Very good. Well, today we are going to be talking about the inner unit.
Okay.
Want to go through the if, ands, why, what's, what is it? How do we use it? How's it important? I've often called it the inner core. I've kind of used those two words interchangeably. So where should we start with this? Well,
I'm going to go, I had two thoughts in my head, but I want to actually start with what is the inner unit so we know what it is, and then we can talk through it. The inner unit is what we also think of as the inner cylinder of the torso. So it's basically the pelvic floor on the bottom, right? That's the floor. The diaphragm on the top, that's our ceiling. The transverse abdominis, the deepest abdominal muscles that run around really the inside front of the cylinder. And then the multifidi, which are on the back of the spine, but create the spinal support for kind of the back wall, if you will. So it's the inner unit is usually those four pieces and those four elements. And a lot of those we want to use reflexively. So I want to kind of bring that up right away, that there was a long time I'll talk history in a moment, but there's a long time when there was a really strong attempts to work on all these things consciously, which is great and a nice way to find awareness and find stuff. But a lot of this area, we want to work without us having to think about it. We want to be consciously or unconsciously competent, that it just fires to support us and we don't have to think about it. That's kind of what we're aiming for in this particular area.
I was wondering about that because when I was thinking about it this morning, my brain was sort of thinking, what do I want to say about this? And I thought the one thing that I always sort of come back to whenever we talk about the inner unit as a whole is, I don't want to say it's part of the autonomic nervous system, but if you think about it, all of them work very reflexively based on what they need to do, what their jobs are. And we'll break them down and go into what each of their jobs are. But it was sort of like, these are almost the automatic core rather than the core that you sort of have to engage from the outside in. Yes,
absolutely. And one thing that I always like to bring up when we start talking about it is, again, you and I have both been in this world a long time. And I remember when the concept of the core first became a thing. I mean, it was a long time ago now. And then it's, of course, evolved in some really, really good ways since then, because that was a fairly limited view of it. But one thing I like to say is that the whole idea of the inner unit was really developed with the view or with the goal of supporting the lower back and decreasing back pain. That's really kind of historically and anatomically and biomechanically where it came from. And the purpose of really exploring the inner unit was really to manage low back pain, that it's considered the stabilizing force or a primary deep stabilizing force for the spine. And that's really where a lot of the focus on the inner unit came from.
Yeah. And that makes sense. That makes sense coming from, forgive me for this, but it seems like a lot of what fitness is and where it goes starts almost with the medical side of things, and I think of like the Swiss ball. Where do we see those first? Physical therapy. And then all of a sudden it comes from physical therapy into fitness. And then now it's just considered a piece of exercise equipment. And I see that there's a lot of things that sort of start with sort of the how to heal the body first before it gets to the fitness world. And I think of this, the core, the same way. It's like, okay, we want to prevent low back pain, or we want to help someone with low back pain. We want to work with this. And then it sort of gradually eased into what used to be what considered, I don't know why. For those of you watching on YouTube, you just saw a whole lot of fireworks behind me. I have no idea why it does that. But it makes it very entertaining to watch. But that sort of gradual shift from being just an abdominals class to being a core class.
Right. And exactly. I mean, how many things develop in our industry is through whatever research is done on a condition or on a way to strengthen an athlete, right? There's a lot of random, not random, but just a wide variety of different kinds of research that's done. And then very often that research is then filtered through minds and bodies and brought into the fitness world or the Pilates world. And it's always interesting what happens when it does that,
Right.
honestly.
No, it's interesting you say that, because you and I have been around for a long time, and we've seen a lot of, let's just say, different methodologies come
Yeah.
and go. And a lot are takeoffs. I'm gonna say takeoffs. I'm not gonna say they stole it from physical therapy or from that world, but they're takeoffs on different techniques.
Yeah.
And they sort of merge into, and a lot of them don't make it, but a few do, and tend to flourish and thrive. And I find that that's sort of that gray area of what is, the medical versus what is the fitness. And truthfully, that's kind of what you and I have done, is sort of bridge that gap our entire careers.
We have, and what's interesting to me, and I know we've talked a lot about this, you and I, is taking some of that information, because remember, a lot of that information, and this is, I think, really important when you start to think about how science moves into fitness, is a lot of that is designed for very particular purposes, like decreasing low back pain. Okay, that's a very useful thing, right? We are going to run into that.
Yep.
But physical therapist's job in general is to solve a problem, right? It's not necessarily to create health and vitality. It's to solve a problem. And sometimes that means that the information is very limited, is very specific. And then what we tend to do in the fitness world, and certainly in Pilates, we've done a lot of this, and I know you have in fitness as well, take those ideas and then try to build them, try to grow on them, right? Try to build a bigger, stronger base for creating health and vitality in our clients based on things you would do with somebody who's injured. But if it's good for somebody who's injured, let's think about it for somebody who just needs to be stronger and maybe to prevent low back pain or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know you and I have talked about doing a specific episode on how to read research, but there's a lot of times when an entire methodology will be based on a single paper.
Yeah. The whole world is built on a grain of sand, literally.
Yes, exactly. And you and I could name a bunch of different, things that were created by someone who did one paper and they've made their career off of it.
Yep.
And right or wrong, that's what they've decided to do. But yeah, I do find that, we do sort of tend to take from that research. And I think we need to take from the research, not necessarily with a grain of salt, but look at all the research.
Yes.
Before we sort of jump into a specific, method. And I find that with the core, there's so much out there now, so much research. Yeah. I mean, you can drown in the amount of research that's out there. Yes, and you're absolutely right. Most of it is about low back pain, but also most of it's done in a vacuum. It's done with very specific parameters, which let's face it, our clients don't live in a vacuum. They don't live in a situation that's going to be specific and, narrow parameters. Maybe bodybuilders and athletes might fit into that, but our general population, probably not so much.
Right. So thinking about the inner unit, right? This inner cylinder, it really does supports our spine, right? It maintains the relationship between the basically the upper body, the spine, and the lower body, right? The pelvis, the lower spine, and the rib cage. It manages and moderates intra-abdominal pressure, right? How that goes. It stimulates or doesn't the organs because, right, that whole cylinder, it's not empty in there. right?
Right.
You've got all
Right.
of your organs inside that cylinder. So it stimulates the organs in different ways. It creates that movement. Breathing is critical to our life function, right? All those things. So there's so many pieces about the inner unit that we want to work with. And again, that we want to try to make automatic. We want to really turn into reflexes, turn into automatic responses for the body rather than, maybe make them conscious first, but then bring them back so that the body naturally responds in the best way possible.
Where did the first thought of the inner unit come from? Because, someone had to create the term, someone had to sort of do that. Do you have the knowledge background or anything to know where it first came up? Or was it just something that has been sort of especially I've seen it much more in Pilates land than I ever have in fitness? Or is it just something that's always sort of been there as an
Uh,
understood?
my understanding is there's an orthopedic surgeon named Patanji
Okay.
who wrote a book on the biomechanics of the spine.
Punjabi?
And yeah, Punjabi,
Yeah.
yes. Who wrote something on the biomechanics of the spine.
Great
And
book.
as
Yeah.
part of that, his specialty was actually making joint replacements.
Mhm.
So he kind of wanted to understand how the joints worked so they could look at, how you do surgical interventions. This was probably 40 years ago. I don't know the date on that. Um, and and my understanding was as part of that, they did a lot of EMG studies where they put electrodes on muscles or in muscles and see what responds to what. And really discovered this whole idea that spinal, reflexive spinal stability comes from an activation at a low level, people, not a massive pull of the multifidi, particularly the multifid and the transversus. That those two together will activate hopefully in a relatively normal way, natural way, to support the spine when stress is put on it. For example, when you
Mhm.
lean forward, or when you go to pick something up, or when you go to open a car door or whatever, it'll hopefully just come in, stabilize the spine against that force that's coming into it.
Yeah, when I've taught classes about core strength versus spinal stability, I talk about sort of the sneaky abs, trying to get abdominal work in inadvertently,
Yeah.
not necessarily
Yes.
directly, but an
Yes.
indirect core conditioning where
Yes.
you're training the core, but not necessarily doing a plank. You're doing something else, but the core is involved as well because we really want to train that
Yep.
for our activities of daily life.
Yep. So think about, like, I always think of that particularly when I think of something like any kind of suspension training, Bodhi or
Hmm.
TRX or those kind of things. The second you take yourself out of the line of gravity, right? You lean forward or you lean back or you lean to the side, your core fires. That whole
Hmm.
inner unit fires to stabilize and support you. That's kind of what it does. And that's what you want it to do. So that if you are in a risky position, you just lean forward to pick up your screaming 2-year-old off the floor. As soon as you lean forward, that whole, when that system's working, it comes in and stabilizes and supports things so you can take the load through that system without causing trouble.
And now with these muscles, from what I know about them, they're often not felt the way we think about. If I'm going to flex my muscles, for instance, I could
Yeah.
feel,
Yeah.
and if I want to tighten my abs when I'm doing a plank, I can consciously do that. But these muscles are ones that, and I've had a lot of clients do this, which is why I'm bringing it up,
Yeah.
is in case someone listening is like, oh, my clients say, I can't feel it and I want
Yes.
to feel it. I can't feel it. How do I know it's
Yes.
working if I can't feel it?
Yes.
These are not muscles that you're going to feel because I'm tensing it tight.
They're very deep. They're not surface muscles.
Mhm.
And the innervation for them is different than something that, like your quadricep or your hamstrings. Like those you're going to feel because they're kind of on the surface of the body, and there's the skin right next to them, and that creates a lot more sensation. These are muscles that really are for many people below the level of sensation,
Mhm.
right? For most people are not aware of what their pelvic floor is doing. They're not aware of what their transverse is doing. They're not aware of what their diaphragm's doing, which
Right.
is fine for the most part. Like you kind of want those things to just carry on without you having to think about them.
Exactly.
Right. So one of the ways we talk about training them, though, is bringing them up into consciousness so that you can start to be aware of if they're working. And I know, like for me, very simply, like this is the simplest exercise in the world to get that inner unit firing. With my clients who have low back pain, and I'm working with them on that, I'll say, okay, so every time you're going to put a stress on your back, all I'm going to have you do is just pull your abdominals in. And you can get a lot more specific and detailed than that, but sometimes it's like just pull it in, then open the door. Pull it
Yep.
in, then lift your child up. Pull it in, then take the groceries in. Pull it in, then do your push-up. Right? It's like just that little reminder of that. And that's ideally what the body's doing on its own. Right? But it may not be. And one of the things they also discovered through research was that clients with low back pain, they're often missing that firing. That either, like the multifid particularly, but multifid transversus, are either not firing at all when they should be, or they're firing after the load has been started through the spine or through the
Exactly.
body.
And that's
Right?
my understanding, definitely, is it's more of a timing issue because
Yes.
it does fire. It fires late. It fires after the load is there and after
Yeah.
the body needed it to
Yes.
fire. So the
Exactly.
body's already taken, and the example I give, my dad actually was one of the people who called me up and said, I wrenched my back. I said, how'd you do it? Said, I was walking through a parking lot and I finished his sentence. You hit your shoulder into a SUV mirror. He goes, how'd you know? I said, I've heard it from a number of clients, and especially of people who are about average height.
Yeah.
That SUV mirror is right
Right on your
there,
shoulder. Yeah, yeah,
right
yeah.
at the shoulder. And if you're not firing at the right timing, you hit it, your body twists, and then your muscles say, oh, I'm supposed to do something. Got it. And then they
Yeah.
tighten.
They grab.
And
Yeah.
that's when they grab and, oh, I can't breathe now.
Yeah.
And instead of all of a sudden getting hit, everything fires to protect you and then bring you right back to center. And you don't think about it. You're like, oh, that's going to leave a mark. And
Yeah.
you go on with your day.
Yeah.
So when your back is healthy, happy, transverse, multifidi fire quickly, fast twitch, and
They even fire in
automatically.
anticipation.
Yes.
That's the other thing. They actually, it's not even that they fire at the load, they fire in anticipation of the challenge coming up.
Interesting. Yeah, when I was thinking about this, I was kind of curious about the difference between, because I'd always heard with the multifidi that they're generally fast twitch muscle fibers because they need to be able to fire very fast. And then I started reading more research and they said, well, there's a high propensity of slow twitch as well. I was like, well, which is it? Every muscle group I know has a percentage and it's a sliding scale depending on the muscle.
And the
But
person.
But what they found was that the superficial fibers of the multifidi are much more predominantly fast twitch. And the deeper fibers are the slower twitch ones, which I found kind of fascinating, that those fast twitch ones are on the outside, sort of, I got you. I'm going to hold you when you need me, I'm going to do it. And even as you said, anticipatory of a response that it's going to be needed.
And to throw that in another direction, and I'm making this up, people, so do not take this as gospel. But when I think about slow twitch and fast twitch, slow twitch generally we think about as the muscles that are kind of just need to be on more of the time. Right? Like your calf muscles need to be on more of the time to keep you upright. Right. Your erector spinae need to be on just to keep you from falling over. Right. So if you think about that, now two ways I'm thinking about the multifida. The multifida, for those of you who don't know, go from the transverse processes, which are those little sticky outy wings on your vertebra, up to the spinous process, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers above. There we go. Brian's got a good image on the screen for you. Right. So it goes up from there. So it's like a little Christmas tree pointing up your spine. And the multifidi cover like 2 layers or 3 layers or 4 layers. Actually, sorry, usually it's 3, 4, or 5, sometimes 6, depending who you talk to and what anatomist you're reading at the moment. So if you think about that, the deepest muscles are going to be covering, let's say, three sections, right? From transverse process up 3 levels to the next spinous process, or 4 levels. Those are fairly close to the bone. They're deeper in, they're closer to the joints, and they're going to be more likely, I would argue, potentially anyway, to be the stabilizers, right? To be the postural muscles, the slow twitch muscles that are constantly in a little bit of action just to maintain the position of the spine. Whereas as you go a little more superficial, right, and they're a little bit farther away, they're covering a little bit bigger area, a little farther up, right, more sections of the spine. If you think about covering 4 sections or 5 or 6, if that's happening, then those could be more fast twitch. because
Right.
they're covering more of the body and they're going to participate more in something like an extension or a more active movement.
Right. That makes
Now,
sense.
that is pure speculation.
No, but it makes sense.
Pure conjecture, but just thinking about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I say, I was just curious as to when I first heard about the multifidi, that's because low back was always my specialty. I wanted to
Mhm.
understand more about the multifidi and the spinal stabilizers. And when I found out they're more fast twitch, muscle fibers, they're segmentally innervated, which means the ones that, the nerve that comes right out in that area affect the muscles right there. Uh, it all I found very fascinating because if something could happen to that one nerve root, certain muscles can shut down,
Yeah.
creating a weak link in the chain. So I always sort of found that kind of fascinating. But the reflexiveness for protection and keeping our spine in alignment when forces are applied on it, either rapidly or to a significant degree, that I found fascinating and thought, oh, okay, so we need to not only train for strength, but also to be able to hold our body in place when we're not ready for it.
Against unexpected perturbances, right?
Yes. Yes.
Right? Because again, if your body's prepared for something, it's prepared for something. Like
Hmm.
it says, I know I've lifted this thing 17 times. I do it this way. It usually works. Great. But like your dad's example of running into the car mirror, he wasn't expecting that. He didn't
Right.
see it, obviously, right? So his body's like, what happened? There's more of
Yep.
that surprise. Or
Yep.
you step off a step and you think there's another step and there isn't. Or there's an extra step, like all those moments when your proprioception essentially goes bad, and you have
Hmm.
more of that impulse or that in that load through the system, right?
Yeah.
That's when you kind of get that feeling of like, what's happening here?
Yeah. When we were talking about transverse abdominis, and you said just having someone pull in their abs, I almost was taking it a step further with some clients because a lot of them don't know how that feels to pull in their abs. They
Right.
learned, they may have learned how to brace. And I actually
Uh-huh.
had a client whose PT taught him what he said, the tissue box trick. And I said,
Okay.
the tissue box trick? So I went and got a tissue box and I said, show me. And
Yeah.
he laid on his back and he put the tissue box on his stomach. He said, when I brace, the tissue box goes up. When I
Uh-huh.
pull in my abs, the tissue box goes down. And I said,
Yep.
that's brilliant.
Yep.
But he could see it. He could see the
Yeah.
visual cue that gave him feedback. So he could now feel what that feedback felt like.
Great.
So that was an easy way for me to begin to teach people, okay, here's how it feels. But also, I wanted to get it a little bit more reactive that for some of my, especially men, not necessarily for my women, men sort of understand this. Say, what would happen if I was to walk up to you and I go to throw a punch and they immediately tighten up
Uh-huh.
without me touching them?
Yes.
And I said, did you feel that? And they go, oh, wow. Yeah. I say, okay, that's your reflexive muscles. They
Yeah.
tightened up and everything tightens up in that moment. Your
Yes.
abs tightened up, pelvic
Yep.
floor pulled up,
Yep.
multifidi tightened up, and I
Yep.
bet that the diaphragm to a certain degree tightened up.
Right.
So
Braced
it's sort of
somehow. Yeah.
somehow, so that
Yeah.
whole inner unit sort of did this.
Yep.
Yeah. And like a corset sort of tightened up and then relaxed. So it's like I said, for men, we like to think of ourselves macho sort of thing. I've used that and I got to tell you, it gets them to immediately feel, oh, that's what it's, oh, I got it. I can feel that.
Nice.
So just something
I
that I've
like it.
discovered that works.
I like it. Um, for women, and again, true for men too, but for women, what I find is because many of us hold our stomachs in all the time out
Mhm.
of, vanity, essentially, there's a real lack of awareness of what's happening there. Like there can just be sort of arbitrary tone, if you will. So one of the things that I'll do, I love the tissue box trick. I've used variations on that over time. But another thing too is I'll have somebody on all fours, for example, and I'll just have them like let their belly hang out and pull it up, and let them hang out and pull it up. We call it pregnant cat abdominals, which is freaks people out. They'll also just say, belly movement abdominals or whatever. And that's another way that they can feel the difference between a relaxed abdominal wall and a toned abdominal wall. I do that. The other thing that I do a lot is essentially any kind of inversion work, whether I've got
Mm.
TRX or a Bodhi or anything like that, or I just have somebody do essentially a wall push up. Stand up, face the wall, hands are right out in front, bend the elbows, and that tip, they'll feel like everything start to fire up, or may. ideally.
Yeah.
They may not. They may need more.
Ideally.
Right, exactly. They may need something a little more intense, like what you do, right? So there's always this with the client. You grade it, like what kind of stimulation do they need to feel it? Sometimes it's a lot.
Well, we've talked about this before with proprioception. I mean, some people have a high amount of proprioception. I know someone who can actually contract their multifidi. They can feel it, they can contract it. And I'm sort of like, how do you do that? Because that
Hmm.
muscle, you're not supposed to be able to just say, oh, there it is, and contract it. And I've had other people that they don't know where their body is in space. They have no
No.
clue. It could be out of the room. They don't know.
Yeah, absolutely,
Our
absolutely. They
body
have a full
dyslexics.
range of sensitivity.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So for some of those people, to get them to feel some of this is really important.
Yes.
And to have that awareness of, okay, what does it feel like? And how can I feel this?
Hmm.
And some people do actually need to touch their stomach, or
Yes.
put something on them and pull in. Oh, okay, I can feel my hands pulled in
Yep.
because they don't have it except for, their sense of touch in their fingers
Yes.
until they can begin to internalize it.
Yes. They need, so this is like, we call this enhancing proprioception, right? And proprioception, just where am I in space and what's happening, is kind of where I think of proprioception is in a very gross way. And creating feedback, right? Like a lot of times if I'm trying to get the transverse abdominis to fire, I'll do the same thing with the multifidi. Somebody may be supine or standing, whatever position they're in, but I'll say, okay, so, breathe in. And on the exhale, pull the abdominals in. Can you feel that?
Mhm.
Right? Can you feel that? Oh, yeah, yeah, I can feel that. Okay, so work with that, right? Because they've got their fingers, which are very sensitive, and they've got an area of the body that is very unsensitive, and they're using their feedback from their fingers to get that to go. We do the same thing, and this is a little multifidi trick been using for years, which is basically, for one thing, just standing, and you guys can join us at home. Put your fingers, if you find your waist, kind of go around the back of the waist, find the spinous process, and then put your fingertips beside that. So you're really in the belly of the muscles on either side of your lumbar spine. So I'm really at my lower spine. And then from that standing position, tip forward by flexing your hips. Don't round your back, just tip forward. And you'll often feel those two muscle bellies pop up. Right. But again, without my fingers there, I would have no idea that they're popping up.
Right.
Right. So that's again getting that feedback to wake that up. And what Brian and I often do with that is we try to get those muscles to fire fairly evenly on the back of
Yes.
the body. The multifidi to go, boom, boom, instead of boom or boom, boom, right?
Right.
Because that means that there's equal force going through both sides of the spine. You're getting hopefully a relatively equal load on both sides of the spine.
And what I will do is on social media, if you check out Moving Combos on Instagram, I will post the forward lean exercise as well as the pregnant cat exercise, uh, and put the description there so you can feel it and do it along with us, because both of those exercises I find are incredibly important to get the transverse abdominis firing. The pregnant cat is so good because pulling against gravity, they can feel. They
Yeah,
can actually
exactly.
feel that. When they're on their back, they can't feel it because gravity's helping.
Yeah, they can't feel it at all. Supine is not the most effective way to feel that.
Exactly. And I find for the forward lean, it's one of the easiest ways just for them to be aware if their multifidi are firing at all,
Yep.
firing together,
Yep.
or is it delayed where it goes boom, 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 or I know I just had balloons go up. Neat. My computer's going wonky today, so please forgive. It's funny. But for years, mine, when I did this exercise, one would fire quickly and the other one would be, here I
Yeah.
am,
Uh-huh. Yep.
here I am. And it's sort of
Yep.
like, come on, what's going on here? And it takes a while, but eventually you can get them to fire at the same time. And I love using that as a warm up. And
Yeah,
I teach
absolutely.
clients to do it at home. Say first thing
Yep.
in the morning,
Yep.
brushing your teeth, do this. Get them
Yep.
to fire as equally as you can within a minute or two. And if you can, it sort of sets you up for success throughout the day. I hope. Again, conjecture. I have no research on this. It's just if you can wake things up early and get them reminded on how to work properly,
Yeah.
hopefully they'll be able to.
I've certainly found, again, both Brian and I have worked a lot with low back pain. when I've got a client who can take that on, I mean, I have seen radical changes in low back pain just from balancing out the firing
Yeah.
around that lower spine. More than once. I remember one guy was a right-handed carpenter, and so his erector spinae were incredibly imbalanced because the right side was like inches. I felt like it was an inch higher than the left.
Yep.
So different in development just from being right-handed and doing a lot of upper body work for a long time. And we just worked on calming that side down, getting the other side to fire. And in about 4 weeks of getting that other side to fire, his symptoms went way down.
Yeah.
Right. And it was one of those kind of simple, stupid tricks that you love as a trainer because your clients think you're a genius and you're not, but it's okay. You can make a
Exactly.
difference, right? Pretty easily, or can.
And how many of us have clients that have that muscle discrepancy from side to side,
Yeah.
especially athletes, people who have
Yeah.
done golf and tennis, especially because they're one-sided.
Yeah.
A lot of times, especially golf is very one-sided. You rarely swing to the other side, but even with
Yep.
tennis, a lot of times your forehand is much stronger than your backhand. So you favor one side. And if you're right-handed and only hit with your right hand, your body is loading unilaterally in a very specific way for years.
Yeah. Exactly.
So it's reversing some of that I find is really important. And to remind those muscles to fire reflexively and evenly, man, can make all the difference in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. The transverse abdominis is easier in some ways. Like the multifid is challenging, but again, that simple little lean and that simple just fingers on it, feel if it's working or not. One other little trick we use with that sometimes is if you're in kind of a small lunge, so one leg forward, one leg back, and you take the tip from there and you come back, come up and down from
Yep.
there, you'll often feel like that can get one side to fire that maybe wasn't firing when you did both at the same time.
Yep.
Typically, it's the back leg that fires a bit more, but not always. So,
Yeah, that's what I found.
yeah.
My theory on that is that side is already in slight extension. So when you take the
Yeah,
other foot
exactly.
forward and lean forward, the side that's in extension wants to fire first. So you take the weaker side and keep that leg back.
Exactly.
So that it just reminds it to fire a little faster. And what I do is I have them start staggered and then move back an inch or two, do another 5 or 6 reps, move back an inch or two until their feet are together, hopefully firing the same. Now, if they start here and they get to here, I'm happy.
Yeah.
Eventually it will get till they're parallel again, but it just takes time.
Yeah. And this is the power of, to put it simply, awareness.
Mhm.
Right? You bring a client to the awareness of an area being imbalanced, and then through that awareness, you give them a tool to help to balance that. And it doesn't always take a lot of time for that to happen.
Yeah.
It's kind of the magic of being a trainer is when you hit on those key things for that client and you help them to understand it and then to be able to manage it themselves. Like that's the magic. That's when things are just, you feel great. They feel great. They've found a solution to a problem they may have had for years. And they think you're a genius, which, you're not, but that's fine. Or maybe you are.
It's also a great way for redirection. And I say this because I deal with a lot of clients who have pain.
Yeah.
And when all their focus is on is pain, for you to get them to focus on something different, a feeling, a sensation that is positive and not negative, it can change their mindset or at least begin to. So you can say, do you feel this? Oh, well, I don't, it's, and I said, do you feel that it's engaging? Oh, yeah. So that's a good thing. It's working. Oh, and you can see they just melt immediately. The defenses start coming down. They're like, oh, okay, that's a good thing. Say you're feeling the muscle work. Good. Stay with that. And you can start to redirect that sort of engagement that they have with pain to, oh, I can move, I can work, things are okay. So I find that redirection and distraction really can help.
Yeah, I mean, one of the key things that modern pain science often says, and I'm paraphrasing a lot here, but really is the creating positive movement experiences for a client, having them focus on what they can do, creating empowerment for them to change something. Those two things are powerful tools in the toolbox of dealing with pain. If a client feels like they have, and it's through awareness that they understand, oh, if I do this, my pain goes down. Right. And once they can start to identify that, then they can start to make that choice to sit this way or to sit this way. right? Oh, this makes me more comfortable. I'm going to sit this way. And oh, I forgot. Oh, now I'm going to remember because that makes me feel better. And it's creating that awareness, because particularly with the low back, so much of it is, what are your habits?
Yes.
Right, that are creating the pain. And if you can just change those habits and discover what feels better, standing on this leg, not this leg, right? Sitting this way, not that way, changing my car seat, whatever it is. Oftentimes, if you can just start to pay attention to those things, that's what makes the big difference.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. So we covered two of the muscles. We
We
covered the
did.
multifidi, or
The
groups
easier
of
ones in a
muscles.
way.
I
Yes.
was going to say, those are the ones that, you know, kinesiologically are easier,
Yes. Tactilely, you
proprioceptively
can
are
feel
easy,
them.
tactile.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are
Yeah.
all the easy ones. Pelvic floor, diaphragm, a little bit more challenging because we don't have the same tactile approach,
Right.
you know? So how do we get those active?
Now, pelvic floor, we will at some point do a whole thing on pelvic floor,
Yes.
because it is a thing, and it deserves its own attention, because it is a real area of, um, it can be a source of real trouble on many, many different levels, and it needs kind of its own attention. But we'll do a little bit of a minimal thing here. So one of the
Yes.
things that I do say here, and take this for what it is, there is not a lot of agreement on how the diaphragm and the pelvic floor work together. Like, you will
Mhm.
literally read well-respected journals that say two completely contradictory things.
Yeah.
And I just think that's just important. So whatever I say, like, you will find somebody who disagrees with everything I'm about to say, and you'll find people that agree with everything I'm about to say. So I just want to throw that out there to start, because there's so much controversy here.
Mhm.
The diaphragm is interesting. So the diaphragm and low back pain, right? Or the diaphragm and this whole system is, I think, in many ways, an underused tool in the toolbox of working on the inner unit, because the diaphragm does two things. I mean, breathing, period, does two things. Breathing can activate our parasympathetic nervous system, decreasing muscle tension and decreasing, a lot of times, decreasing pain just through activating the rest and digest and calming features of the nervous system. Because a more jacked up nervous system, more stressed nervous system will often lead to more pain. So that's part of it. And then the diaphragm lives right inside the dome of our rib cage, right? All the way along the bottom, attaches all the way along the bottom of the ribs, and then goes up as high as our fifth ribs, the center of our chest. It's like a big, big dome in there. And it interacts directly with, or if there's fibers that connect, if you want to think about it that way, the transverse abdominis and the diaphragm, they attach at the same point on the bottom of the ribs. Different fiber angles, but same basic attachment. So there's a direct relationship between them. And there is. So, like, if you breathe in, what happens? Most likely, unless you're controlling things, you've learned particular things, or you have certain habits, most likely when you breathe in, that diaphragm pushes down into your abdominal cavity, right down into that cylinder, the inner cylinder we talked about, and pushes your belly out.
Mhm.
And when you exhale, that diaphragm lifts up into your chest, decreases the pressure on the abdomen, and your belly comes in. Right?
Yeah.
So just breathing is going to activate. Remember, the transverse abdominis' job is simply to shrink your waist, if you will, simply to draw that wall in. The fibers are horizontal, and they just act like a great big belt or a great big corset or a great big girdle, and just pull everything in when they contract. So breathing, every breath we take is going to stimulate some part of that reaction in the transverse abdominis.
Mhm.
Right? Or not, depending, if you're a very dysfunctional breather, there's other issues. So breathing has a direct impact on that.
And we've seen that for years when we've done abdominal work, we'll often cue the breath
Mhm.
that to exhale out because that can actually assist. Now, the other thing that the transverse abdominis does, and I am witness to this in the past week because I've had this massive cough, and every time
Yes.
I cough, my transverse abdominis contracted hard.
Yes.
So, and if anybody's had one of these coughing attacks where you can't seem to get any more air in and you're sort of expelling all the air out of your lungs, you can see that the transverse abdominis actually will help with that forced exhalation. As
Yes.
that tightens up, it's actually assisting the diaphragm in getting all of the air out. And like I said, I've had that a lot in the last week. Thank goodness it's gone. I'm very happy for that. But it can be very debilitating when it hits you, but you
Yeah,
can feel that. So if anybody's
yeah,
had one of those coughing attacks, you know what it's like and that they work well together. And when we've
yes.
done abdominal work, especially planking or anything like that, we'll often cue, as you breathe out, your transverse abdominis is going to work with it and reflexively tighten up.
Now, what I want to bring up here is something that, again, another controversy in this area, which is this idea of bracing,
Hmm.
right? How does bracing interact with all of this? Because abdominal usage is often talked about in different ways in Pilates, and I'm going to be specific. In Pilates, there's a lot of emphasis on pulling the abdominals in and then doing your curl up, for example, right? In a lot of other fitness situations, and certainly in some other exercises, you're not so much just pulling the abs in and then doing your curl or whatever, but it's more like you're just holding the whole wall steady.
Hmm.
Right. So it's like if I'm trying to lift up something, I kind of pull things in, but I'm not sucking my belly button to my spine necessarily. I'm simply creating more tone around that whole cylinder. So the transverse abdominis is working, but it's not like sinking into my belly button, right? It's just
Hmm.
like pulling in so that I can stabilize that whole rib cage, spine, and pelvis to lift something up or add load to it or whatever I'm doing.
Right. It's sort of like
Yeah.
the way I always describe it to clients is bracing is creating additional intra-abdominal pressure to support your
Yeah.
spine
Right.
because it's creating that, unlike the transverse abdominis, which what it pulls in is sort of like that inner corset. This is almost the opposite in that you're trying to trap the air in there and create almost a Valsalva maneuver by increasing the intra-abdominal pressure to increase the pressure around your spine so it stays in place. And there's a time and a place for this, and it's taught often after surgery for the spine because
Hmm.
that's when people have no control over their abdominals whatsoever. So a lot of physical therapists will teach how to brace to keep them safe during the initial, 4 to 6 weeks afterward. But how many of them go the extra step and teach them how to properly use their abdominals without that bracing? Because you and I both cue, I think,
Yeah.
very similarly. When I do any abdominal work, it's pulling the belly in, it's not bracing. It's much more about controlling it, pulling it in to when we're doing movement, and often linking that with the breath at times.
Right. And the other thing too there is what are you doing? I mean, if you're trying to do spinal articulation, you can't do spinal articulation with a brace, right? Bracing
Nope.
is like sort of holds everything together. You think about like, those long skinny balloons. I always think of bracing as like blowing up one of those long skinny balloons, right? So it's like it's firm, it's stiff, but it's not got a lot of flexibility.
Sort of kink.
It's going to kink, right? It's going to kink instead of folding. But if I'm trying to do a roll up or have somebody articulate their spine, I can't brace. I can use my abdominals, but I've got to use them very sequentially almost, right? Very differently in order to create the support around the spine, but also create the mobility of the spine. So I
Well,
think
that's
bracing, yeah,
Yeah, when we talk about doing a bridge, for instance, we
right.
have the articulating bridge versus more of the hip thrusting bridge, the
Yep.
mobilizing bridge. And if you're bracing, you cannot articulate your spine. There is no way you're going to
No.
roll up one vertebrae at a time.
Mm-mm.
And it's not until I can get the client to understand we have to do a pelvic tilt and pulling in using the abdominals to help with that. Then all of a sudden they're like, oh, I can feel it. And nobody's perfectly smooth, but at least they can begin to feel a little bit of that spine beginning to articulate as it
Yeah.
comes up.
Yeah.
But so many people, when they get to me, they've only learned how to brace and bridge. And
Yes.
what happens, they jerk their hips up, their lumbar spine tightens up, as does everything. And that can be kind of counterproductive.
And they often go into extension with that too. Right. They
Exactly.
kind of they kind of get thrust, and then they get that compression in the low back if that's a problem for them. So the pelvic floor, depending who you talk to and who you read, the pelvic floor responds to that change in pressure. That diaphragm, right? The diaphragm breathing is going to change the intra-abdominal pressure, and the pelvic floor responds to that change in intra-abdominal pressure. How it responds is where the controversy comes in.
Yeah.
Yes. So, but ideally, the pelvic floor is again responding to that cylinder. It's creating what tone is appropriate for the cylinder at that time.
Hmm.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think of it sometimes. I like to think of the pelvic floor as holding the pelvis together from the inside,
Yes.
right? Rather than, and I use the analogy of a building with rebar inside, right? Now,
Yep.
you probably know the history of architecture. Maybe you do. I have no idea what your background is, but the reason that Chicago, which is kind of one of the beginnings of high rises, basically why Chicago could actually build higher buildings than we used to be able to build was because they decided to put rebar inside
Yep.
concrete.
Yep.
And that allowed them to go up, as many floors as they needed to because the support was inside.
Yep.
You compare that to something like Chartres Cathedral, where you have flying buttresses. The support of the walls is on the outside, holding them together, right? And so I think a lot about the pelvic floor as being like, and the multifid too, but the pelvic floor is being like that rebar that holds you together from the inside. And creates again the bottom, the stability of that pelvis, but also then feeding up into the transverse and feeding up into the multifid, because its fibers also come up and interact with where the transversus comes down and attaches onto the pelvis. So there's an interaction there.
It's exactly what I was teaching a few weeks ago in a pelvic floor class, is that inner, the strength coming from within and holding your entire pelvis together. All those muscles, when you really look at the muscle fibers of all the muscles, and we're going to get into the pelvic floor in another episode, but all those fibers are sort of pulling everything into the center, really creating, that bowl in the bottom coming up and supporting that pelvis, from the ground up. And rebar, I mean, you and I had talked about it years ago. That's the perfect example, because concrete by itself without the rebar is relatively weak.
Yeah.
But as soon as you add the steel supporting structure inside, it becomes exponentially stronger.
Yes.
And a properly working pelvic floor does the same thing. It gives the bottom of our inner unit that structural support to support from down below.
So I'll throw out a couple things in terms of, again, part of the controversy here. So some of the thoughts here are that when you breathe in, so the diaphragm goes down, that increases intra-abdominal pressure. Some people say, and honestly, I think people have very different strategies about this. So I think all of these things will happen in different bodies. Some people say that, okay, so then you increase the intra-abdominal pressure. The pelvic floor has a couple of possible responses to that. One is it can tone up slightly to manage that pressure and push it out through your abdominals. That makes sense? Yeah. Or it can relax a little bit and allow that pressure to be taken up and kind of absorbed, if you will, by the pelvic floor. And a lot of that just depends on the tone of the pelvic floor and the health of the pelvic floor.
Yes.
Because if you think about somebody who's sneezing, right, hachoo, and if you think about what the pelvic floor is doing on that hachoo, right, I'm like forcibly expelling air from my lungs. I'm getting a little bit of that pull in, that increase in intra-abdominal pressure. And if the pelvic floor is healthy, you don't pee when that happens, right?
I was going to say, you have to keep things in at that moment.
Right. So, not everybody does, as we know, like incontinence, especially in those circumstances, is really common. Right. So it's like, how does that diaphragm and that pelvic floor work together to maintain the integrity of that cylinder?
And that's where that reflexiveness comes in.
Yeah.
Right. And I think you nailed it right on the head, is depending on the health of the pelvic floor. Because I think in younger, healthy people that don't have any pelvic floor dysfunction and things, I think it does probably have some of that elasticity that when we naturally breathe in and out, it's working with the diaphragm to sort of engage in that. But I can also see that someone who's older, who doesn't have the same amount of elasticity or strength in the pelvic floor, they take a deep breath. Well, what's going to happen? That breath has to go somewhere.
Yes.
And especially, as you said earlier, for vanity's sake, some people who are naturally always sucking their stomach in, well, I take a deep breath in, but I'm sucking that in. What's going to happen? That breath has got to go somewhere.
Right. And it's going to go down to the pelvic floor.
Right. So I think it depends on the person and their tonicity of those muscles.
And whatever strategy they've developed, because one of the things, Brent Anderson, who's a big name in the Pilates world, a physical therapist, did some research at one point where he was doing essentially kind of real-time ultrasound, where he kind of was and looking at the action of the pelvic floor during different activities. And he was working with a whole group of Pilates teachers who supposedly know how to activate their pelvic floor, and was looking at how the pelvic floor is responding to different cues and different breath patterns and that kind of thing. And what was really fascinating, which has certainly been my experience in talking to people and working with pelvic floors with people, is everybody had a different idea of what, number one, everybody had a different idea of what was happening. Like, I think I'm pulling my pelvic floor up. I think I'm pushing my pelvic floor down. I think I'm keeping it neutral. Like, that was the idea in the head. And the real-time ultrasound showed that the connection, like the image here and the image there, were not the same.
I bet.
Like, very few people actually knew what their pelvic floor was doing when they thought they were pulling it in or releasing it or whatever. So, that told me even more that we need to approach that area kind of around the back door, like looking at it directly, thinking about, okay, I'm pulling my pelvic floor up. Maybe you are,
Right.
maybe you're not. I don't really know. And without some pretty major equipment, I'm not going to know.
Yeah.
Right. So much like we said with the reflexiveness of the multifid and the transversus of leaning forward or the, tilting, that kind of thing. A lot of our responses in the pelvic floor is simply to work the pelvic floor by using the hips, by using, like side leg lifts and squats and lunges and walking and all those kind of things, which help to tone that whole area up. And allow it to have the tonicity to have the proper reflexive action.
Right.
And there's a lot more to be said about pelvic floor, but that's kind of my quick and dirty two things to be said.
I was gonna say that I was wondering how we were going to mention the pelvic floor without getting too deep, because
Right.
we both know we could teach a 4-hour course on it in a heartbeat, because there's so much going on,
There's so much
there's
going on. Yeah.
so much going on. So, to wrap up, I think the understanding of what the inner unit is kind of essential to really understanding how our body works reflexively,
Mm-hmm.
how our core is supposed to work.
Yep.
Because if it's working properly, I can engage the outside muscles of my core a lot more effectively. And I can utilize them a lot more effectively when I'm doing a squat or a lift or a lunge or a combination of moves when I have to pick up something off the ground that's relatively heavy. So I'm doing a deadlift and then carrying it across the room. Those muscles need to be able to fire reflexively and keep my spine stable and safe throughout that whole activity without me the whole time going, please don't hurt, please don't hurt, please don't,
Exactly.
And that's
And
really where we need to start with that.
Yeah. And ideally, again, I mean, to follow along with what you were just saying, it's like, this isn't about holding your holding your abdominals in and just for the rest of your life. Now, when you have acute low back pain, there can be a period where you just hold that sucker together and you don't move because everything hurts. I totally get that. I've been there in moments myself, and I think Brian has as well.
Oh yeah.
But then you have to then be able to move past that when it's appropriate, because you have to be able to lean over and put on your shoes and reach across the car and lean in the back and move your torso in all those various ways while maintaining that support. And also the inner unit, right, works with the outer unit with all of our more superficial muscles in the torso to create that support while we're going into much bigger, more dynamic movement over time and when it's appropriate.
And a few weeks ago, we talked about training the core in other ways besides, especially for our larger clients, training the core in other ways besides, your traditional way, where we're loading the body from the side, loading it with a tube, loading it in different ways. That's really important because your core is firing. If I'm just standing here pushing a band forward with my right hand, well, guess what? That wants to twist me over to the side. So in order for me to stay upright, my core has to engage. And so think about that when you're doing some of your general fitness stuff, whether it be in Pilates or whether it be in fitness. Go unilateral. See if you can work the core in a way that is indirect rather than so, plank focused or crunch focused or whatever, roll up focused. Try and see if you can sneak it in, because I find that that's going to help your client be able to engage that when the time comes when they need it in real life.
One other little thing I'll throw in there just as a final piece is unstable surfaces, a roller, a ball, the spine fitter, like all those things as well, really help to activate the core a lot more strongly, especially doing something where you're not moving the core, you're not doing a curl, you're not doing a bridge, it's just staying steady, lying on a roller and moving your arms and legs. Right, that's we sort of think of as sneaking the core in. The core has
Yep.
to fire to keep you from falling over and rolling off the roller or the ball, but it's not actually moving those joints. And that's a really lovely way to work the inner unit, right? Is to find a situation where it has to work to hold you together, but it's not necessarily creating spinal mobility, which oftentimes in the beginning with a back pain, you don't have a lot of spinal mobility that's comfortable.
And when working with a client with one of those tools, especially the foam roller, I'm thinking, or the spine fitter, which I loved to do for this, the more you can get them to relax, the more you're reminding the inner unit how to work reflexively rather than tightening up. Because the first time you put someone
Yeah.
on an unstable surface, what are they going to do? They automatically tighten everything
Yes.
because they're scared. They're
Yeah.
afraid to fall off, even though you're only 3 or 4 inches, 6 inches off the ground.
Yeah.
But when you can get them to relax and just start marching and just start moving an arm, moving a leg, and they're not thinking about it, and you can see that they're in a more relaxed state, that's when you're really turning these muscles on and reminding
Yes.
it, here's how to get it to work properly, without that tenseness.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, that's what I was looking for with the unstable surfaces is can you kind of find that ease within
Yep,
that complex situation? Because that's what you're trying to train your body to do is find that support no matter what is going on.
exactly. Well, we covered a lot today,
Again.
and we
And we
always
discovered
do.
that we have to talk about the pelvic floor in more detail at some point and probably unstable
Absolutely.
surfaces, things to add to
I
our list.
I'm gonna write that down right now, unstable surfaces,
Yeah, I think
because
so.
I think that is something that would be great,
Yeah.
for us to cover. Also, an episode on just the core,
Yeah.
because I
Yep.
don't think we've devoted an entire episode to what is it, how to work it properly. So
No.
today we did the inner core, so down the road, we can focus on a little bit more of the core.
Yep.
So, and be on the
Love it.
lookout. I'm going to be posting the forward lean as well as the pregnant cat exercise. So you have something that you can utilize in your facility with your clients to remind them. I'll also do some of the unstable uh, surfaces just briefly, just to remind you, here's other ways that you can really get these muscles to begin firing and get the person to relax. So be on the lookout for that.
Awesome.
As always, if you like what you hear, if you're enjoying what we're doing, give us some great comments online. When you see us on Instagram, do me a favor, give me a comment. Don't just, hit a like, because it actually helps us. We want to get in front of as many eyeballs as possible, especially in the fitness world. But I'm finding we're getting more people who are coming from, the layperson who just wants to understand their body more. And this is a great way for them to sort of have an introduction to that and maybe be able to ask their trainer, hey, should we be focusing on this? Maybe it'll up their trainer's game. So that's
Nice.
something else to think about. So our socials are at Moving Convos on Instagram, especially, as well as if you go to our Facebook page, Moving Conversations, and you can always follow Nora and I both on our personal Facebook and Instagram as well. And if you have any questions or you want us to hit a certain topic, we got someone from Serbia wrote me last week and requested a specific topic, which we're going to cover in the future. I'm going to hold that off and tell you what it is in the future. Hit us up at movingconvos@gmail.com, movingconvos@gmail.com. And until next time, keep moving.
Thanks, guys.